All right, so Mao's economic policies and social policies. This is part one. This is our last chapter. Some of the policies that we'll be looking at have already been covered, but not in detail. So this chapter is dedicated to the details of that. So the first 5-year plan is the first policy we're going to be looking at. It ranges from 1952 to 57. This was a way Mao was determined to industrialize China the way that the Soviet Union had done that. In order to achieve this, they wanted to make sure that the production was owned by the people, but the economy was planned by the central authority. So this is known as a command economy. So the first 5-year plan was introduced, and it was, the idea of just having China have the potential of a massive workforce. So this is where you start seeing a lot of people moving from the countryside to urban cities. The population doubled from 57 million to 100 million. The Sino-Soviet Agreement, which is just means the Chinese-Soviet Union Agreement of 1950, guaranteed that USSR would give economic assistance to China. This included resources, advisors, all of that. But there's some parts of the negotiation that kind of soured, and kind of made China bitter because they felt like they weren't getting the better end of the bargain or they were getting cheated out, especially with the high loan interest. But just to continue, under the 5-year plan, coal, steel, petrochemicals were the target for industrialization. The transportation industry was a priority. Many civil engineering projects were started. Overall, the pressure to reach industrial targets was intense. Next one. So that plan happened, but now they move forward with a different 5-year plan known as the Great Leap Forward, which takes place from 1958 to 62. The goal was to basically modernize China through industry, make it a powerhouse, make it strong, and self-reliant because they had been bitter about being so relying on the Soviet Union, that they wanted to gain a little bit more independence economically in that sense and not rely on them. And so, and even though the peasants were a big part of the success of China early on, especially with the revolution, Mao thought that the best way to kind of move forward with this was to use the industrial workers in the cities. So they implement two movements. One known as the general grain, which is to increase food production, and the general steel, which is to turn China into a successful industrial economy. The idea was the peasants will make extra food for the country, and all of these profits would then go back into developing the industry, which would then create a modern industrial economy. Um, so they're using agricultural to kind of build up that other aspect, the industrial culture in China. Next one. So the Chinese people got to work, and they were very proud to get to work. They wanted to show what they could do with their hands, even though the fact that they lacked machinery and equipment and basic tools. And so a lot of them were just kind of using very like minimal basic tools and mostly their hands to achieve a lot of these things. One of the first projects was to expand Tiananmen Square, which is just like think of it of a plaza, a placita, right? So a lot of countries have this. Mexico has one, the city of Mexico, where that big statue of the angel is, the golden angel in the city of Mexico. That's one of them. Moscow has the Red Square, but Mao wanted his to be the biggest out of all of them. And he did achieve that. I think for that time it was the biggest. I'm not sure if it still is. I think it is still the biggest, or China has 2 or 3 of the biggest in the world. So they did that. The project was a success, but there were other parts where they were not as successful in their projects, like for example the backyard furnaces campaign, where not only factories would be producing steel to transform their economy, iron and steel, but also families who had furnaces in the back or were given furnaces. The idea was that these families would make their own steel and then give it to the country to kind of build up the economy. The problem is communication, lack of communication. A lot of these people were using old pots and pans they didn't really need, and the steel that they made out of that was useless. It could not be used at all. So, just to move forward, state-owned enterprises is the next section. From ideological and practical reasons, the industry was brought under government control. So you no longer had private firms, companies, or anything like that. You no longer had monopolies. I mean, there was a time in China before Mao where there was like 1 or 2 families that owned the egg monopoly. So only 2 families were the ones that were responsible for the production of literally the eggs. Mao comes in, takes that away, and if you see the word SOEs, just know that that stands for state-owned enterprises. Um, Wages, prices, and production was fixed by the state. SOEs were given subsidies, and any surplus was given to the state. The problem was that a lot of SOEs were pissed off about this. A lot of company owners who formerly owned or managed or whatever, um, who might have still been in charge, now they had to answer to the state and they had to do what the state wanted. So in retaliation, they were kind of holding their companies back. So production falls, efficiency falls, quality falls, all of that. In contrast, though, the true winners, even though the CEOs and the former owners lost, the true winners were the workers, the people who were working, because they were guaranteed an iron rice of bowl. It's a dicho, it's a saying, un dicho, a saying where basically you're guaranteed a job, guaranteed protected wages, guaranteed medical and health benefits as well, and a lot of these people had not had that before. Next one. So while production did look strong in some areas, there was some weaknesses in the second 5-year plan. Production didn't always, the material didn't always reflect the increase in manufactured goods, management skills, and technical skills. Um, that was lacking in China. The USSR stopped providing, technical assistance, which resulted in the closure of half of China's 300 industrial plants. The middle class and the upper class were trying to find ways to sabotage all of these plans. And then Mao just did not have enough scientific knowledge to execute some of these plans. He just thought that having a lot of people work on these things would be enough. So these weaknesses kind of held back the quality control of production, the consistency, and the applied communism going forward. Next one. So the Great Famine is a result of this as well. So we start seeing shortages. So the idea was land reform was done, and was a big part of the consolidation of Mao. The idea was, the revolution is tied to the, food production and efforts of trying to increase the workforce and modernizing China. Land was collectivized, farmers going from owning individual plots to them owning one big plot, and as a community, they're all working together. Landlords were eliminated. In order to achieve that, though, the collectivist, uh, land that was collectivized, in order to achieve that, they got rid of landlords. So landlords had to give up their land and give them to the peasants. Peasants were encouraged to work together on those plots of lands. Peasants were placed into cooperatives, again, working together to work the land. And the household registration limited the number of peasants who could leave the countryside because they needed people to work. Remember, a lot of people were trying to go to those factories and leave the countryside. So that happened. And then peasants were put into communes, and private ownership of the land had ended. So again, it's just the community working together as one to achieve these things versus, everybody doing their own thing on their own. Okay, so that happened. By the mid 1950s, step 1 and 4 had been achieved in order to achieve that land, the collectivization of land. But the increase of grain production had not reached the workforce. China had a labor shortage, which played a role into why China had not achieved the production goals of what they wanted to achieve for food. Between 1957 to 58, many communes were created. You had about 70,000 communes that were established. Over 700 brigades, army units were established per commune, and each one included about 200 households. The PRC central government controlled farming methods and sales and distributions of the productions and setting the price. So yeah, just to continue to reiterate all of that. Next one. So again, Mao claimed that this was done for the peasants. This is what the peasants wanted. And although the peasants had been the force that moved the revolution forward, Mao did turn on them and brought in a Soviet researcher known as Lysenko. I'm just going to say it's Lysenko, and implemented his methods which were known as Lysenkism. Sorry, I have a hard time pronouncing Russian names. In 1958, his methods. So Lysenko's methods were basically attempting to eliminate pests and the idea was if we eliminate the pests, then we'll have more food because those pests are the ones that um, are eating the grains and eating the seeds. So the entire population was basically told to get rid of these birds, these sparrows that were eating the crop seeds. And so they did this by banging on pots and kind of scaring them away, you know. This did work, it eliminated them, but because they destroyed these birds, you see an influx of insects, which makes sense, right? This is how an ecosystem works. And so those insects, instead of eating the seeds, they start eating the grains. With the shortage of grain, thanks to the insects, this led to hunger and famine. And so a lot of peasants attempted to return to their old ways of farming, but they were advised and forbidden from doing so. But this is just causing a lot of chaos. Next one. Um, with this, there were many regions in China impacted by the famine. The high end numbers, the extreme numbers, estimate 45 million people died, right? While millions did die, and a lot of people did die, and the numbers were high, these high, super, super high numbers are usually exaggerated by biased historians, which is, unfortunate. And the reason why the numbers look so high is because they lump together the deaths of all the people who died, even if they didn't die by the famine. We're talking about people who died through natural disasters because there were a lot of natural disasters happening in China during that time. There was massive flooding. There was in some areas, while other areas had massive droughts, right? The water has to go somewhere. So the water that where you see the droughts in was actually the water that you see in the massive floods. And a lot of people were dying from that. And so they count those deaths and deaths from other health related issues that were not attached to the famine as part of the deaths impacted by the famine. So, which is why you see an estimate of the numbers as high. So think about, and also think about the fact that the Chinese population grew during this time period as well. How can you have, elimination, which is the estimate of a 10% of the Chinese population eliminated when the Chinese population is actually growing during this time? Central China was hit hard. Many parents had to sell their children to make ends meet. The problem wasn't necessarily addressed as aggressively as it should have been. Mao admits this, and people did not question Mao, but Mao admits eventually that his plan failed, and he takes part of the blame. But he also did blame people who were hoarding food out of fear, but also people who were hoarding food to sabotage these plans as well, and local authorities who were not handling the situation appropriately, natural disasters such as floods and droughts. And so there is some grain of truth behind some of these excuses that were being used, but Mao also takes some of that blame for himself as well. This did stain his reputation. He had to step back, as we remember in the previous chapters, when Liu and Deng Xiaoping step in to reverse these things, and they do help, and with their policies, but moving forward, then they were pushed aside again. But that's it for today. Have a good day. Bye.